This is lecture number 12 in History 2111. We spent some time talking about the early English colonies in our last lecture. I want to continue that today by talking about the Chesapeake colony originating at Jamestown, and then the Puritan colony in Plymouth in Massachusetts. We might as well characterize the types of colonies that the English practiced. You have royal colonies whereby the king would appoint a royal governor over the colony. You have proprietary or joint stock colonies. These are essentially business ventures where men would invest money in a colonial venture. This is much like Jamestown. And then you have charter colonies whereby the colonists themselves create their own charter or their own government. A good example of this would be the Puritan colony in Plymouth. I want to compare and contrast these two colonies. The Puritan colony in Massachusetts with the Chesapeake colony centered around Jamestown. First of all, the demography of the two colonies is quite different. In the Chesapeake, you have mostly single men coming to the New World in the anticipation of getting rich and then returning to England, perhaps marrying well and becoming part of the gentry class. The Puritans, however, bring their entire families over, husband, wife, children, in-laws. They have no intentions of going back to England. They view the New World as, like I think I said earlier, as sort of the New Jerusalem. So the demography is different, their purpose is different. If the Chesapeake men are seeking wealth and fame in the New World, the Puritans are seeking a place in which to practice their own peculiar brand of religion. There's a myth about the Puritans that they came to the New World for religious freedom. This is ambiguous. The Puritans did not come to the New World to establish a place of religious tolerance. In fact, quite the opposite. The Puritans came to the New World to establish a place where their particular brand of Protestantism could be practiced. They were not tolerant of any deviance or any deviations from their orthodoxy. In fact, prominent, well-known Puritans were driven out of the colony for proposing alternative orthodoxies. So religious freedom is a bit misleading. And on the other hand, of course, in the Chesapeake, religion did not play nearly the central role that it plays up in Plymouth. Other differences, the Chesapeake colony, of course, would in time become a slave society. The labor on the tobacco plantations would be performed by African American slaves. Now, the Plymouth colony, on the other hand, would be more accurately characterized as a society with slaves. There were slaves and there were indentured servants, but slavery in Massachusetts was incidental to the success of the colony. Much fewer numbers and of much less importance, whereas in the Chesapeake, slaves were central, fundamental to the economy. In New England, at Plymouth, societies began to be organized around villages and then towns and cities. In the Chesapeake, societies were organized around plantations. In New England, you see the emergence of churches and schools, and in these cities, different retail outlets. In the Chesapeake, much less so. In the Chesapeake, the plantations are almost like feudal manors in medieval Europe, where virtually everything is made there on the plantation. So there's a fairly dramatic difference in the way these two colonies operate. The Chesapeake colony is situated in an area of the world that is much more hazardous to one's health. The climate is much more difficult. the insects, and on and on. If you've ever lived in the Chesapeake area around Washington, D.C. or Jamestown, or traveled through those areas in the summertime, you can attest to the brutal conditions there. Of course, New England has cold, where the Chesapeake has heat and humidity, but the New England climate is certainly contributes to a longer and better and healthier life than the Virginia or Chesapeake climate. What else can we say about these two English colonies? I think you could say that the economic capital for the Plymouth colony would be the emerging city of Boston. The economic capital for the Chesapeake colony would still be London. Remember that the Chesapeake plantation owners are sending tobacco back to London. Their Scottish factors, as they called them, or broker would be a good word, control the sale of the New World tobacco. They purchase items that the plantation owners desire, and they send those items and the profit from the sale of the tobacco back to the New World. So the Chesapeake farmers are quite dependent on these tobacco factors in England, men that they have never met and in all likelihood will never meet. So there has to be trust here between the two. And we will see in the 18th century how this will become a contributing factor to the American Revolution, as the Chesapeake farmers, men like George Washington, for instance, will become increasingly dissatisfied and suspicious of their dependency upon these tobacco brokers. The economy in the the economy in New England is quite different. The soil and the long winters prohibit commodity crops like cotton or tobacco or rice or indigo. So the economy in New England has to be much more diversified. There's plenty of timber there that you can use for shipbuilding. In fact, many of the New Englanders are sailors, and they venture into the Atlantic to the Grand Banks, the great fisheries. They carry on trade with the West Indies. The farming is of a much smaller scale, a much more of a subsistence type farming. You don't have the large scale agriculture in New England, a much more diversified economy. Both regions, however, both Chesapeake and New England, come under the purview of Britain's navigation acts. We should probably raise the idea here of mercantilism, whereby the colonies exist to enrich the mother country. Colonial products would have to be all sent to England first, where they're taxed, before they could be sold to a third party. We will see in time how mercantilism will also be a long-term cause of the American Revolution. There's one final thing here I want to say in comparing these two early English colonies, and that is the rebellion, Bacon's rebellion in the Chesapeake. By 1675, the older established Virginia government and colony had pretty much eliminated the wars with the Indians. The Indians had been pushed westward over the Blue Ridge, and peace had prevailed now for some time. Yet this peace was threatened by the constant inflow of Englishmen coming to the New World, to the Chesapeake, to seek their fortune. These incoming Englishmen pushed the English boundaries westward toward the Blue Ridge, over the mountains. The one thing that the New World had in great abundance was land, cheap, plentiful land, and these Englishmen came here to acquire their fortunes. Well, as they moved westward, they inevitably came into conflict with the Indians. Now, the older established English government in Williamsburg, Governor Berkeley, I believe was his name, they had no desire to stir up the hornet's nest of Indian wars again, yet these incoming British immigrants were doing just this, or as they pushed further and further west in an attempt to gain this cheap land. This will lead to Bacon's Rebellion, as Nathaniel Bacon leads a group of Englishmen in attacks against the Indians, thus stirring up the wars between the colonists and the Indians again. Bacon will then turn his wrath on the colonial governorship, including Governor Berkeley, turning the Chesapeake colony upside down for a while. Bacon will die an early death, I believe, of typhoid. Nevertheless, this will have an effect on the Chesapeake colony, resulting in the limitation of royal, not royal power, but of the governor's power, and sort of recasting the whole English-Indian conflict again here at the end of the 17th century. Finally, I want to say one more thing in contrast between these two colonies, because it will have an impact as we get closer and closer to the Revolution. The New England colony, the Puritan colony, with its families, with its towns, its schools, its churches, is a good deal more egalitarian than the Chesapeake colony. The Chesapeake colonies tend to be hierarchical. You have plantation owners at the top of this hierarchy. You have lesser white Englishmen, and of course at the bottom of this hierarchy you have a continuing importation of African American or African slaves. So it's a society of hierarchy, as much in the way we think of as feudalism in Europe, where there are distinct classes. So the New England colonies have a sense of egalitarianism, with very little slavery, with indentured servitude, generally white men from England, Scotland, Ireland that could work for a set time under contract and then be released from that labor to make their own fortunes in the New World. You don't see this sort of mobility or egalitarian spirit in the Chesapeake region. This, of course, is a fundamental difference. We will see these two regions come together and overcome these differences during the American Revolution. But a half century after that, or 75 years or so after the Revolution, we will see these two distinctly different types of societies unable to reconcile. And this will lead, obviously, to the American Civil War, which will dominate the middle portion of the 19th century. So I'm going to stop there with this discussion of these two English colonies, and we'll talk about the Salem witch crisis next. Thank you.